Welcome to the Seasons of Sobriety podcast. This is a podcast where you can join the journey of other recovering alcoholics and addicts. You will be on the road with them as you listen to how each person came into recovery and how they persevered through times of anger, sadness, fear, and joy. I am your host, Howard M. I am here to share my own experience as well as the experience of other recovering brothers and sisters. I am so grateful you have decided to join me today. This episode features Tom P. from Clifton, New Jersey. Tom has been sober since February 14th of 1989. Tom's story is one of challenge and diversity as he started his journey in Narcotics Anonymous and later found a place in Alcoholics Anonymous. His experience spans many of life's challenges and celebrations. His message is one of perseverance and ambition. He has been through several life cycles in sobriety, from getting married to having a daughter who has only known him as a sober father. He has also gone through the painful process of the death of a parent and untangled some of the knots of a difficult childhood. Here now is my interview with Tom P. Tom, I want to welcome you to the Seasons of Sobriety podcast.
Thanks, Howard.
I'd like you to take us back to around February or even before that, January of 1989, just before you're getting sober, and can you describe what's going on for you before you come into the program?
Sure. So my life was unmanageable, although I wouldn't use that terminology back then. I was drinking and drugging on a daily basis, or at least wishing I was, because I didn't have any other answer to life in general. And at that point, I had lost the power of choice and control in terms of when or if I could get through a day without drinking or drugging. So I was being driven by my alcoholism, by my addiction. Circumstantially, I was living at home with my parents. I was 18 years old. I was working for my father at a family business. I was lost is the best way to describe it. Kind of directionless. I was not realizing the whole powerlessness part of the disease, again, as we define it in the program, but I was feeling hopeless because I was doing the same things over and over again. I would spend whatever money I could scrape together, up all night partying, although it wasn't a party. Let's call it drinking and drugging. And at the morning, as the birds were chirping and I figure I can get like 2 hours of sleep before I got to go to work, I'd say, I'd never want to do this again. I feel horrible. I can't face another day like this. And I would, scrape by the day, just making it through a day's worth of work. Sometime around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd get the idea that maybe I could do it differently that night. That I could either drink or drug successfully, or that it would be okay this time, that I could, or I wouldn't have a thought at all, which is even the scarier part, that I would just be at the projects suddenly, on my way home from work. And that was the scary part, that I had lost that decision-making process. I was drinking and drug which took me down was crack cocaine. So I was using that on a regular basis. And the part which got me was the hopelessness. I didn't see a way out of this cycle of using day in, day out, and that was probably the most debilitating part of the end of my run, which was I wanted to end it. I didn't know how to end it. I didn't know what ending it looked like. I didn't know what life without drinking and drugging looked like. I just didn't know. I just knew that this felt horrible, and I could not stand doing this day in, day out the rest of my life. I had lost the hope that it could be anything different than this. I had contemplated suicide, mostly, as the most passive way possible. Like, I didn't want to wake up the next day, and kind of got angry when I did wake up the next day. Like, I can't believe I got to do this day all over again. I often thought about, crashing my car, thinking like, I could, if I drive in this bridge abutment, maybe things will change, because I needed catastrophic events to change my way of life, because I had lost the power to make any changes myself. But I also thought about, I used to drive home from work, which was in Elizabeth, back to Clifton, and I drive along Route 21, which is alongside the Passaic River, and I thought maybe if I just pull the steering wheel hard right, one day and go through this guardrail, that could be the end of me, an end of this horrible life that I'm living that I saw no way out of. So that was where I wound up, just in desperation and hopelessness.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite a spot to be, right?
Yes.
And so now it's your sobriety date is February 14th, 1989, right? So
yes.
Now it's, we'll say February 12th, 13th. And what's going on there as you come on in?
So it was February 11th. Mm-hmm. I had been up at some point the night before, drinking and drugging. I was headed off to work. I worked on Saturdays, and I had a morning shift. And for me, that meant if I can get there before noon, that was good enough.
Technically, that's the morning. Right?
Yeah, I was not a model employee. And hey, it's my dad's business, so whatever. And so what better? I think I was working an overnight shift, which I did occasionally on Saturdays. And I think what better way to get me through that shift by more crack. So at like 10 o'clock in the morning, I stop at the projects to get some more. And as I'm coming out, I can't remember if I was in the car already or not, but a cop pulled up and next to me. And I literally, surrendered to the police. We talk about, first step surrender moments in the program. Mine was I surrendered to the police because I could have ran, I could have swallowed the drugs, I could have done a number of things to prevent me from getting arrested, or at least made it harder on them. I just said, okay, here you go. Like, I just gave up. And in a way, I'd always been waiting for something to happen to give up to, right? I was always looking for a way out. I just didn't know what that way out was. And I was so beat. So at 10:30 in that morning, or 11 o'clock that morning, I was in a jail cell in holding while they, figured out what the bail was going to be for a possession charge. At the time, there was a police officer who had arrested me, who basically was asking me these questions. He's like, how old are you? How long have you been using? And I tempered my response because I didn't want to seem like someone who had, was using more than I was. I was trying to, gain some sympathy. But he said, hey, you've got parents and people who care about you. Maybe this can be an opportunity for you to get straightened out and, get back on the right track. And I said yes, but it was half-hearted anyway. I was just wanting to leave me alone, really. But I think he planted a seed for me, that maybe this is the opportunity. So a couple hours later, my then girlfriend's mother, my future mother-in-law, bailed me out because I had called my mom and my brothers and some friends, and nobody wanted to bail me out, which is always a great feeling when no one wants to bail you out because you've burned all your bridges. And so my girlfriend's mother came up with the money. God bless them both. And a few hours later, I'm out, and and I messed around for a few days. It didn't feel good getting arrested, and I had to face that music. And my dad, for all the complications I've had with his relationship over the years with him and myself, he said, "Do you want help?" He had asked me, and I said yes. And 2 days later, February 14th, it was a Tuesday morning, 8:30 in the morning. I'm on my way into Beth Israel Hospital in Passaic, where they had a rehab called The Arts, which is no longer in business. And I started my rehab on that date.
Okay. And how long were you in rehab?
I think it was 28 days. It was the standard term back then. And first time I've heard the term of like addiction and 12-step parlance. My experience with people who were in recovery before that were two people. One was this kid in high school who disappeared for a little while, came back, was really weird and straight, kind of dressed nicer, and was I don't know what program he went to, but he was like the first person who I was aware of who stopped, and that didn't look appealing to me at all. And the other one was my sister had a boyfriend who I think went to NA but kept drinking, so it was again, mixed messages about what recovery was about. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't exactly the, upstanding example of anything really.
Yeah. Right.
So in rehab, 12-step rehab, didn't realize at the time, but they really emphasized the 12 steps. Took us out to AA and NA meetings, brought AA and NA meetings in, did a lot of workshop, set group therapy type stuff. I had a therapist, or whatever you call a counselor, in the rehab. I learned a lot about addiction, family of origin, or dysfunctional family, I think was the hot term back then. Talked about triggers, a lot of the addiction and disease information, which really helped me because I had no clue what was wrong with me. I think that I wound up in this situation, and for the first time, I got a feeling for who I really was. And I tell the story of like that. If I hadn't found a 12-step program and fellowship, I might have joined a cult. Like I just was looking to belong somewhere, and I felt so disconnected from everyone else. And I still have my original NA basic text, and this thing is highlighted like crazy. It's like, oh my God, that's me. Oh, I identify with that. Like it was a huge relief for me because I had felt so alone, disconnected, and so isolated from the rest of the world.
Yeah. I was thinking about when you're in treatment. I wasn't in treatment, but I know when you go to treatment, they throw a ton of stuff at you, and it's hard that it's going to all stick. So when I ask you, what's the one or two things that stuck the most, it's like, thank God they told me this.
I think the thank God they told me this was that I had to have a plan. That like, you're leaving this facility. What's your plan? Where are you going? What are you doing? How are you going to address it? I had their recommendation. I moved out of my parents' house when I left, mostly because my mom was still drinking. There was still some guys, close neighborhood, friends, that type of thing, who were still drinking and drugging. So it was a people's, places, and things type of move. And it was like, okay, what's next? Okay, what are you doing Tuesday night? What are you going to do Wednesday night? What's your plan? And that was really helpful for me because I was clueless about a lot of stuff leaving the facility.
Yeah, when I was thinking, when I got sober, I was living in a fraternity. And so a lot of people, when I first was going to meetings, they said, oh, so where do you live in town? And because I was in college, and I told them, oh, I'm in a fraternity on campus. And they're like, oh. So they did their best to provide me with as much attention to keep me out of that fraternity and keep me out of the Friday night and Saturday night kind of things, all the temptation, and people who really took care of me when I was in a spot where, had they not, I don't know that I'd be sitting here.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. The other big thing they drove into us was the whole people, places, and things. It's like there's circumstantial events and triggers to using, right? That if you don't go there, you can't do this. If you're not with that person, you can't be influenced. And it was really where I started to understand that I did have some choices based on that knowledge, that I could start moving things around in my life to make it somewhat easier.
Okay, good. All right, so now you're in. You've left treatment. You've tried to remove as many people, places, and things as you can, and you're now going to meetings. You're 18 years old, 19, 20, which in this first couple of years. And what's it like being an 18, 19, 20-year-old in AA in 1989?
Well, it was NA first. I spent my first 10 years in NA. And I think there was one other teenager in our area. And there was some events and stuff that were going on to kind of keep people busy. I wound up, it's interesting. I wound up with an older crowd to begin with, like just by the nature of being young and an addict alcoholic. When I was active, I spent time with older people, right? I started drinking when I was 10 and started smoking pot when, probably that same summer. And so it wasn't like there's a lot of other 12-year-olds to get high with. So I always ran with older people, and in the fellowship, it was the same way. There were guys who turned into like older brother figures for me and replacing my real older brothers who I was able to hang out with, guys who were a little bit more established with careers and families and stuff. And I spent time learning from them what it was like to start to transform into an adult.
Okay. And do you think that their maturity perhaps elevated you to the point where you could not give into the temptation of going back to all your friends who were 18, 19, because when they were, you've been doing this since you were 12. You now know all these people who are older. You could just go right back to that.
Yeah, I think it did make a big difference. The fellowship of the program made a huge difference for me because I was able to kind of immerse myself in meetings and the diner afterwards and movies, and things like that, to replace all the stuff that, it wasn't like I had a lot of friends. It wasn't like there was interesting to hang out with outside of doing drugs. So it was actually a big relief and a transition to start to develop friendships that way. Okay.
Yeah, you were saying even before the relief of the police officer coming to find you, like, okay, I'm not going to make up a story. Here it is. And now the relief of, okay, there's somebody who's going to care enough about me. Good. Let me know what my next step was with you guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the pain is sometimes that motivator of I got to do something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to mention that, like, I didn't intend to stick around. Like, this was a temporary thing. I was looking for it to look good when I got out of court, when I got out of rehab, when I went to court, and I didn't think I needed to stay sober the rest of my life. And certainly, I thought that there was good and bad drugs, and I don't like. In the beginning, I didn't think alcohol was a big thing, until I did an inventory of my relationship with alcohol. But once I started hearing other people stay sober during hard times, like parents passing away, divorces, good things, marriages, kids being born, like, I'm like, oh, okay, this thing works in all circumstances. I talk about my second step experience started in rehab, where I came to believe that I could get sober at all, right? I stay clean no matter what, based on people doing 12-step work and bringing those stories in. But then going to meetings, lots and lots and lots of meetings, hearing people over and over and over again, staying clean and sober based on life's terms, all those excuses and rationales and reservations I had just got wiped away.
Okay. Yeah, just by hearing people's experience through life. Yeah. And like you, I came in, I was 21. Nothing really happened to me yet. So it was good to know that when stuff was going to happen, there were people who could help me out with it.
Yeah.
So, good. All right. So now you're getting this, the fellowship piece and everything. And now it's time to pick a sponsor. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
I picked a guy. My first sponsor was just a guy.
Remember his name?
Yeah, John.
John.
Yeah. It was like, I knew I had to pick a sponsor. I'd waited, quote unquote, too long to pick a sponsor. I like what he had to say a couple of times. I know. I caught him completely by surprise. Like, he's like, I don't think he was ready to be a sponsor. So it was uneventful, I'll put it that way. And I think I got, as a result, like, I didn't work the steps because he wasn't driving me in that direction.
Okay.
And I didn't have the kind of motivation to do it myself. And I've heard you tell this story as well. I saw other people working the steps, and it just made me resentful that they were getting better.
And I wasn't.
It's like his sponsor's taking him through this stuff. I'm like, damn it. Yeah. And then I forget when, but at some point, that relationship fizzled, and my second sponsor was a guy named Tom A, who had more time, and people called him Spiritual Tom, right? And he had that air about him, which I liked. He seemed to not be affected by life as much as I was, caught around the axle, as they say. And he was, and he had something that I wanted. So like that was my second sponsor, and he took me through my fourth and fifth step. And so that was a great experience. I had Tom for a number of years.
Okay. And so leading into that, what was your first fourth step like?
Well, first of all, I heard someone say fourth steps take 5 years. It's 4.5 years of procrastinating, and
6 months of writing.
6 months of trying to write, and then probably like 2 months worth of writing. So my problem was like, and this is not disparaging about NA, it's just my experience. There wasn't a lot of concerted step work like I find today, and so it wasn't like there was a formula, right? When I started going to AA and reading the big book and looking at the format of the columns, it's very specific, right? The NA basic text, which was out when I gotten clean and sober, was really their only product. The step working guide hadn't been out yet, hadn't been written yet, the 4-step guide. So, and again, plus the people in our area in that recovery group and that type of thing, it just wasn't a thing. So I wasn't getting driven to do a 4th step other than the pain. No one was directing me to do a 4th step. It wasn't like there was 4-step workshops or anything like that, at least commonplace. And when I looked at the 4th step, right, and I go, like, I didn't know what a resentment was. Like, I didn't have a clear definition. It's like, people I'm angry with. Well, everybody, I'm done. You're like, yeah. And so I struggle with that, just the concept of an inventory and what that meant. And so I wound up coming across a 4th step guide, which was colloquially called the California 4th step. Mm-hmm. I think it actually came out of one of the rehabs like Hazleton or somewhere like that. Okay. It is 300 something questions. Oh, okay. It is a detailed questionnaire about your life story and how alcohol and drugs came into play. One thing was I was in therapy at the time, so it kind of coincided with that. Like therapy pulled back some of those layers of the onion, mm-hmm. which caused problems because I didn't have any other step work in place and I didn't have any other relief. So I was kind of going through all this primary childhood trauma, not having any other relief outside of that. The detailed inventory that I took really helped me because it was questions and answers about each stage of development. It was like, okay, early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. And it's like, okay, what's your relationship with this person and that person? And what was it like growing up? And did you have money or not have money? And was there emotional abuse, physical abuse? Like it was literally Q&A. And I was like, okay, I can answer questions when asked.
Okay.
And that was really helpful for me. So I got through this like mammoth 4th step, and I sit down with my sponsor and I'm reading through this thing, and I forgot how long it took, and he had to go to work. He's like checking his watch and stuff, and like, I should have let him know how bad this was going to be ahead of time. Probably would have scheduled more time. But he basically said, like, he shared some things like, you're not alone. I did this, I did that, right. And it was a bit of a relief to go, okay, 4th step done, 5th step done. I came away with more knowledge about myself, which was, I think, the goal there.
Okay, very good. I jumped ahead a little bit. I was going to also talk to you about your relationship with the God of your understanding. So could you talk a little bit about your work with step 2 and the God of your understanding?
Yeah, great question. I think that when I looked at God, I just went with a God. I didn't have a religious upbringing, didn't have any spiritual life to speak of. I thought that if there's something out there, something's in play here, because I wound up in NA and AA and sober, so there must be something out there, right? Because it seemed insurmountable before it happened, right? Before I didn't need to drink and drug anymore. So I just went with, hey, there's a God thing, and and I heard someone describe it as, we don't care what your God is, as long as it's kind of loving and kind, and and so I was able to kind of create my conception of a higher power early on that way, and it was very generic. Eventually, I developed more of a understanding of a higher power just through the other people's experiences. So I was like, okay, that sounds like an interesting idea about God. I'll take that. I call myself a spiritual mutt because I just take things from all different walks of life and different spiritual and religious practices.
Okay. And what in recent years has helped you form the relationship you have now with your higher power?
In recent years, it's been a lot of reading. I love the 11th step because it talks about seeking. And so that's very specific instruction, right? So I read a lot, and I listen to, different speakers and podcasts and religious and spiritual leaders or quote unquote gurus, just to get some ideas about what higher power is like and what a concept of a higher power is like. And I've run the gamut. I was involved with my church. I actually picked a church and started attending and was heavily involved. I was a Eucharistic minister for a while, considered becoming a deacon. That didn't go through, mostly because they had this thing where if my wife died, then they wanted me to remain unmarried. And that was a deal breaker for me.
Okay.
Not that my wife has died since, it would have been, but it was like one of those things like, really, you should just be happy I'm a deacon, right? But, the most interesting thing was that came out of that conversation with my parish priest, Father Rento, who's just this wonderful man, really just helped me understand God and develop a spiritual life, is two things that came out of my conversation with him. One was that he asked me why I wanted to get involved. And I said, well, I want to be of service. I wanted to, do more, right? Because I was doing service in program. I want to do service in my community. And he said, there's ways to do that because this was before we had our daughter, Madison. He asked about being a parent because being a parent is all about being of service.
Okay.
And he made the connection between those two, which I hadn't considered before. And the other thing which he helped me with was he used to say, see God in the ordinary, right? We go to church, we go to synagogue, we go to retreats, we meditate, all those types of things. We read, spiritual, religious texts, but God exists in the ordinary. And all I need to do is be open to experiencing that. And it helped open me up to realizing that I didn't need to do certain specific things to experience God.
Right. And, God wasn't only experienced through miracles.
Right.
Upheavals and unexplainable events.
And that I didn't need to be a spiritual, religious person in order to connect with God. It's not a mutually exclusive relationship to only priests and gurus.
Right. It's more like the candles rather than the cake.
Yeah.
Right. I can light my candle with your candle.
Right.
And then now we both have light.
Yes.
So it's like, well, God's there to share. He's not mine or yours and that kind of thing. Yeah. Good. Okay.
Oh, so let me just finish on the concept of a higher power. So I've moved away from the idea of a deity that's interactive, right? I know that there's some power working in my life, right? I experience the presence of a spiritual nature of something greater than myself, mostly when I'm working with other people. I'm having an intimate relationship with someone else, working the steps, having a conversation, helping another person. I don't see a God as kind of micromanaging, and it's a cliche because it's true. Is God is love. It's and more not the noun love, the verb love. It's in the act of loving other people, that I get that experience.
Yeah. Because I see God more in my relationships with my wife and my son, and even with people I work with I work in a religious school, and, many of those people are religious as well. And that piece connects us in a way that, when I work with them or talk with people, they something happens in your life and they say Mazel Tov, or they say thank God. There's always an expression of bringing God into the picture rather than excluding him.
Yeah, so. We had a topic the other day at my morning meeting, and it talked about God and relationships. And I forgot how it landed there, but I used to hear people say, like, there's always three people in a conversation. It's you, the other person, and God. Like, or bring God into your relationship, and God should be the third party. And I was like, that's the last thing I want to do, because how am I going to get what I want out of a relationship if I keep bringing God in? He's just going to get in the way. Yeah. But it's so true now that I experience God through relationships with other people. And if I bring that higher power into the relationship, if I pause just a moment before engaging other people, there's a better chance that that's going to happen in a positive way. The end result's going to be better than I will produce on my own. Yeah.
Just this morning I was talking to my wife, and in this presence of quarantine with the COVID-19, and as I am around the house and we're more around each other, I got the sense I wasn't being a very good husband. Okay. And not because anything she said or anything, but there was just an air, something in the air. So this morning I actually said to her, I said, I'm concerned about something. And she said, uh-oh, what's the matter? And I said, no, it's nothing. I don't know if I've been a very good husband lately. And it seems like I haven't. There's some things I could be doing better. And so she said, oh, yeah, if you could just dial it back a little bit on some, I was a little uptight about a couple things, and I was teasing but it seemed like I wasn't. And so I actually thanked her for being honest. Yeah. And I think, again, God was probably in that moment of, I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to take a hit if you got one, and she had one. So it worked out pretty good.
Yeah.
All right. So earlier, as we were talking about you coming in, and one of the things that really helped you was people talked about their experience in getting through some of the things from the more difficult times in their sobriety. And I know when in the preparation for this, you had mentioned some things to me. It's very difficult over the past 31 years for you. And I would like you to touch on some of those. You said in year 5, you were, having some feelings of suicide again. And I'd like you to, talk about that.
Sure. So one of the things which happened is, as I mentioned earlier, about the lack of push towards step work and that I experienced my program was meetings and fellowship and service work, but not the step work. So when you're sober a few years, things start to come back up. I've seen it for many people, right? Some sooner, some later. So I had some early childhood trauma, had some middle childhood trauma. And since I wasn't self-medicating anymore, those memories were coming back and the emotions were coming back, and I didn't have any defense against them. And so I use the analogy that, I worked the steps theoretically, right? Which meant I looked at the wall and go, oh, those are great in theory. Yeah, I can powerlessness. I'm good with that. Well, fifth step, well, I kind of talked to a therapist, so that's fine, right? That counts, that's a fifth step. And I've said sorry plenty of times, so that's 8. Well, and yeah, I'll pray, even though I don't know what I'm praying, or how I'm praying, but, I could pray, that's fine. So I was picking and choosing, and working the steps theoretically gets me theoretical results, not actual results. And the theoretical results was being, in our parlance, restless, irritable, and discontent, and emotionally unable to handle life. And so I was feeling suicidal all over again. And I say all over again because not only in my story do I talk about at the end of my using, I was suicidal, but also as a young kid around just before I started drinking and drugging, I, had that same feeling of, I can't believe this is my life. I can't believe I was put on this world to put on this earth to suffer, and maybe I'd be better off not living anymore. And in a very strange way, alcohol and drugs helped me get through that part of my life and dull my senses enough to get through it until I came into the program. The problem is that, around 5 years in, I've got all this emotional baggage that's suddenly, coming back around again. Like the luggage carousel at the at the airport. It's like, here it comes again. Oh, and just unequipped to take care of it. And knowing that using wasn't an option, like I had tried that and it hadn't worked for me. And so I'm back to feeling hopeless and helpless again. So what I did was I was sharing this with my therapist at the time, and she wound up working through it with me more intensely. And I also went to codependency treatment. She was a recommendation from her. We went to a place, I went to a place called Karen, had a 5-day inpatient. It was called codependency treatment back then. I think they call it something else now. But essentially they work on family of origin stuff. And it changed my life because there was all this stuff which I hadn't even considered as part of my isms, right? Like I knew I was an addict, and eventually I identified as an alcoholic, but that emotional stuff, I just didn't realize how deeply embedded it was in me, and how much my relationship with my, primary people, my mom and my dad, were affecting me. And so I wound up coming out of that treatment, doing a fourth, fifth step, finishing that work, doing more step work, going to other 12-step fellowships to kind of address my periphery isms, and coming out of it without hurting myself or others. What was interesting was I heard people in the rooms talk about feeling suicidal.
Yeah.
Right. Which made it okay to talk about it.
Okay.
And that was the blessing. And hearing people talk about a lot of issues, not necessarily the primary drink and drug issue, really was helpful because it gave me permission to explore that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes when I'm in a meeting and they're reading whatever statement it is, I'm not sure, please confine your discussion as it relates to alcohol, your problem with alcohol. I'm like, well, I don't have a problem with alcohol today. I have a problem with how my boss talks to me and how my wife talks to me and how, and traffic. And so I guess I don't talk about anything except my problem with alcohol. And I think what they mean to say is, as it relates to your alcoholism.
Yeah.
And I know it's parsing words, but someone might be confused that, oh, I'm only supposed to talk about my problem with alcohol here. And you're demonstrating that, no, if you did that, I might not be here. So I'm glad you didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. My group, I think, says alcoholism, right? Which, as I've found out, touches many areas of my life.
Yeah. Alcohol and alcoholism are not the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. And I also went through my own fair share of, we called it inpatient codependency treatment. And I was, for about a week in groups and one-on-one and every day for, I think it was 6 days. It was in Florida. And while it was one of the most painful experiences to go through, it was the best experience to go through. It was, digging deeper than I knew what was there, and yet had to do it. Do it. I was just in a position where the relationship with my mother and my father, what I like to say is, these are people who were supposed to protect me, and they didn't. In some cases they hurt me, and they thought they were doing the right thing, and I got twisted up in a lot of it. So
yeah,
they helped me untie a lot of those knots.
Yeah, I used to joke that I was raised by wolves, right? But then I realized I was insulting to wolves, right? Wolves take care of their pack and their young people,
Right.
And what was great about that work was, again, I was able to identify with another group of people who were in similar position in terms of a lot of alcoholics and addicts who had gotten to a certain point in their recovery, who had uncovered things that they needed to deal with that just needed a little bit extra help in a certain area. So that period between, I don't know, probably like 5 and 10 years of sobriety, I probably went to like 6 different 12-step fellowships, ACOA and Al-Anon and some other 12-step fellowships, and dealt with those other things. I'll just say, the isms, and got some focused help and got relief.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the thing that I started to understand was the statement with emotional sobriety, that when Bill Wilson talks about having an unnatural emotional attachment to things, that's where I learned about that stuff. I didn't know I had that until someone showed me what that looked like.
Yeah. I understood that because I hadn't looked at my primary relationships, that I was messing up all my other relationships. It's not everyone else's fault. I was picking people who were going to repeat those same patterns for me, right? So it's my people picker was bad.
Yeah, yeah, and the joke we kind of had after they'd release you, they'd give you a treatment plan. They would say, by the way, your statute of limitations for blaming your parents on who you are runs out when you're 32 years old. Okay, yeah, it's a joke. Like you can't, you know that they're part of the problem, but you have to fix you. It doesn't really matter. And so I did get caught up a little bit of, it was just easier to blame them than change myself, so gotta be careful of that one. Okay. So there was another one that you said something in here about sponsoring yourself. Could you talk about that a little bit?
No, I don't want to.
Okay.
Because it's stupid. It's like the trap of, a lot of A's. It's get a little time, get a little away from meetings. Man, things aren't so bad. Don't really need a sponsor. Not being connected to a home group. Not being tethered. And suddenly I start to think that I'm okay. And for me, it was I was between sponsors and just hadn't found somebody who was doing it for me, right?
How much time do you have at this point?
This I call my teenage years. Somewhere in that teenage years of sobriety, where I was going to lunchtime meetings and I had some sponsees there, and it was a really good group, but there's not as much fellowship associated with that because I'm just kind of running back to the office, and a great group, Fireside in Upper West Side of Manhattan. Loved the people there, and it was great for a number of years. But again, it's just I was coming home. Madison was 5, 7, 8 years old or whatever it was, so more stuff going on at nights here at family life. So not going out to so many meetings locally, and I wound up disconnected. It's the best way to describe it. I wound up realizing that this was happening. I don't know what the awakening was for me, but I was going to some meetings and I was wondering why no one wanted to be sponsored by me. Why I had no sponsees. I think that's what happened for me was I'm sitting like, I got like 19 years in the program, 19 years in the program. I sound good at meetings. Why is nobody asking me to sponsor them? Because I knew that was important. Like I should be giving back and sponsoring somebody. So it's a bad space. I always warn people about it, because it's a trap. For us alcoholics and addicts, we fall into this, well, it's not so bad. Right? Not so bad is the enemy of recovery.
Yeah.
So I wound up around 19 years sober, going to the AA meeting up the street here, Friday night men's group. And I'd pop in a couple times, and I just made a decision I'm going to start going regularly. And I raised my hand like a newcomer and said, I'm trying to make this, I want to make this in my home group. I'm trying to reconnect. I've got 19 years. This is awkward for me. And I'm looking for a sponsor, so I'm taking all your old inventory.
Right. That's great.
And then shortly after that, I'm not, a couple months later, whatever, I picked a guy, Phil, to be my sponsor. He was a wonderful man. He's since passed away. We started working together, went through the steps again, spent a lot of time together. And I, recommitted to the home group and step work. And all of a sudden, guys want me to sponsor them. Magically, that just happened. But, once I reconnected to the program and started doing the right things started happening.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I want to say it was around 2005. So, I don't know, maybe I got 16, 17 years. And the sponsor I had at the time, Tim O, was a great guy. And Tim, suddenly died. He was swimming one day and got out of the pool, had a heart attack, and he's gone. And, he was just a huge part of the community, AA community in Summit, New Jersey. And, so people, those of us who had him as a sponsor, kind of, we talked to each other a little bit afterwards, and then we stopped, and then I just didn't have anybody for about I would say at least a year, maybe more. But talking about how good a sponsor Tim was while I didn't have one. Oh, what Tim would have told me is this, and what Tim would have told me is, So in this, absentia, but it got worse and worse and worse. It goes to my, the question, hey, who's in their last 90 days? I could have been, that's how that happens, So, yeah, it's almost everybody I know who's got the teenage years. I love that. I'm in my adolescence. Yeah. I'm fine on my own, dad, mom, right? And it's like this. It's a huge pattern, and it may be unavoidable. I don't know, but
not coincidentally, since making that decision and getting connected and getting a sponsor and redoing the work and getting sponsees since age 19, year 19, it has been a tremendous growth and satisfaction for me. It's been the best years of my life consistently. There's been some stuff up and down, but like smooth, recovered sailing as a result of focusing on the program and doing the work and going to meetings and helping others. It's working as advertised.
Yeah. I never could have imagined things would get as good as they've gotten, so to speak. And you have an expression, you haven't said it yet, so I'm going to say it. You say, my problems look like bragging.
Yeah.
And me and you have talked about, in private, some of the things that we have going on where if I were to say this at a meeting, I think it would sound obnoxious.
Right.
People are like, oh, boo-hoo. And so sometimes a meeting isn't the best forum for me to discuss things.
Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, one of the things which shifted for me also during that period is, you just mentioned sometimes a meeting is not the forum, right? Mm-hmm. I used to think, and this goes early days, and for however long it lasted, is I thought a meeting was a place for me to dump. Yep. And maybe as a newcomer, that was okay because I didn't know what the hell I was doing, and maybe it's something I needed. And I've come to believe that as I hate to say this, an elder statesman of AA, as an old timer, that meetings are not a place to dump. Meetings for me are a place to carry the message. I've got experience, strength, and hope. I know how to recover from alcoholism and a lot of peripheral things that come along with that, and that I've got a solution. And in a meeting, 99% of the time, that's what I think I should be sharing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I early on had a sponsor who taught me, I'll say, how to talk in a meeting in a way, what was appropriate between me and him and what was appropriate in public, and that if I hadn't worked step 11, maybe I shouldn't be talking about step 11. He said, we don't need your opinions about step 11. This goes back a long time ago. It was, the reason I'm bringing up 11 is because it was an 11-step meeting, and I was chairing it for some reason. And we were using the big book, and went around people talking about the 11th step, and then I started talking about 11th step, and my sponsor was there, and he knew I hadn't worked the 11th step, but I'm still talking about it. So after the meeting, he said, let me ask him, what chapter is the 11th step in? And I said, 11. And he said, really? Can you show me? And me and you can laugh about that because we know that it's not in chapter 11, but it's just that whole almost like Spinal Tap, like these go to 11. That's what it has to be 11, right? So I was pretty full of it. And so he said, like you said, we're here to hear your experience, your strength, and your hope. And he said, and it's not up for debate. I don't need to debate your experience. It's what you've experienced, so share it. Mm. So you have down here around year 23, talking about making amends to your mom. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So my mom, this is, talk about wildest dreams stuff.
Mm-hmm.
My mom is an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
She'll tell you that. You don't have to, not me taking her inventory. My mom's an alcoholic, and she was active for a number of years. And I had to, in recovery, cut her out of my life or minimize my exposure to her because it was so painful to experience her active. And around year 9, I had the opportunity to bring her to her first AA meeting. Well, save the circumstances for her story,
sure.
But I'll just tell you that something happened. She asked me to. I brought her to her first AA meeting. She's been sober ever since. So she's got over 20 years in the program. And I've made amends along the way with towards her and for pre-drinking stuff, right?
Sure.
But as you well know, the most painful amends are the ones to make for sober years and behavior that I did when I was supposedly no better. So I wound up doing an inventory with Phil, as my previous sponsor, and we were looking at it. And one of my defects was about being judgmental, and so I was judging my mom harshly, I'll say, based on some family stuff. Long story short, mom and my dad have a complicated relationship, and she decided to take him back and take him in when he was sick. And I thought she was wrong for doing it. I thought that, that everything that he had done to her, that she didn't need to, that she was being tied down as a result. Me making judgments and decisions for her, right? So it was like, there's a problem with that equation. And I saw that through inventory.
Right, when she powdered your butt a few years ago.
Yeah.
Not so long ago.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But I know better. Again, that's one of the death knells for alcoholics and addicts. I know better, right? I got this. I know better. Those are warning signs. So I wound up doing this inventory, realizing I was judging her for this, and I decided to make amends. And so I reached out to her and met up with her and talked through what was going on, and that I was judging her harshly and developing a resentment about the fact that she took in my dad and I didn't agree with it. And so she turns to me and says, well, I did that to make amends to him. It's my amends to him for what I had done in my life. Wow. Is now I'm taking care of him. And my jaw dropped. I'm like, of course. Like, I am so narrow focused sometimes in thinking that I know everything, that I can figure out what's good, right, what's wrong, and how people should behave. And then I hear this simple answer from my mom, like, "Oh, I'm making amends to him. That's why I'm taking care of him. This is my part."
Right.
And it blew me away. And it not only did it help our relationship, but it helped me understand that anytime I start to do that, I know better, I think I know what's right, I put myself in dangerous territory, because not only does it block out possibilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would
Right.
have never seen this, but it also it shuts me out from relationships with people.
Yeah.
Right. I can't experience God and anything else in my relationship with other people. And if I start judging them and making decisions about their lives and thinking I know better, I've essentially shut myself off from God.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a huge lesson for me.
Yeah. When I say to myself, I can't think of a reason why they would do this. Right. You can't.
Right.
So stop trying, because you don't know. Yeah. And bringing it a little bit back to your dad, because I know he passed away not too long ago, and you had a chance to think about that relationship as it was ending, so to speak, not through your own choice or anything. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. If I give credit to anything in the 12-step fellowships, it's about the process that can bring someone like me to a place of grace, I'll say, in relationships, and specifically with my mom and my dad. And my dad was, I'll just say, a complicated man, right? So generous at times, violent at times. There's a lot of chaos in my household growing up, and I'm not going to take his inventory here in this session, but just to say it wasn't a happy childhood as a result. And so I spent a lot of years wishing him dead, thinking that we'd be better off without him. But however that turned out. Also, a lot of years I worked for him as well, and that was complicated because I couldn't have a personal relationship and a business relationship with the same person, who was my dad. And through the 12 steps, being able to both come to terms with, I need to make amends, I need to worry about my side of the street, right? Which was part of it. And then the stuff that wasn't my part of this, or my side of the street, that I could forgive. Like, I didn't think that was possible. I could just forgive. Like, I know it sounds trite, like it's like an on-off switch, but I have a choice to forgive. I didn't even know I had a choice to forgive. And some of that stuff started happening to me around year 10, when these resentments that wouldn't go away, and I kept feeling like a victim. I was declaring myself a victim, right?
Okay.
Of course I'm stunted emotionally. You would be too if you had my parents, right? All that stuff. That's the same story I used to drink and drug over, right? But now I used it to be, a bad friend and husband and a worker. Once I realized that the only way I was going to be free was to stop clinging to the identity of being a victim. And in order to do that, I needed to forgive the people in my life who caused me harm.
Yeah.
Regardless of the fact that I was a kid and I had no part in it. And when I tell my story and talk about the step work, I was reading the fourth step wrong. I thought it said, we look at our part. So I was like, oh, I've got no part. I'm 6 years old. There is no part in it. Which gives me perfect justification to hold a resentment for the rest of my life.
Right.
Go back and I read the literature again and again and again. It says, where was my mistake? My mistake is holding on to resentment for decades, shutting this man off from my life because I'm unwilling to forgive, and living shackled to the past.
Yeah.
And once I started that process of forgiveness, and the prayer of St. Francis was really important to me to help change my attitude and my perception of life in general, but start to think about service and understanding versus selfishness. I was able to work through that. So my dad gets sick, and he winds up moving in with my mom, and my mom takes care of him, and his health was declining. And I helped out a little bit. My mom and my sister took care of him primarily, but I took care of him occasionally. And he had a couple hospital trips, and I went and took care of that. But when he passed away, I was okay. It was a really weird feeling to go okay, this relationship is all right. Mm-hmm. Like, I thought I'd be dancing on this guy's grave.
Yeah.
Right. I thought I'd be tortured because of all this unfinished business. Yeah. But the 12 steps gave me opportunities and instructions on how to deal with that relationship. So that way when he passed away, I'm like, you know what? He was a complicated man. I'm sitting in the funeral home and people are coming up and saying, your dad was great and he helped me out this way, helped me out that way. And I'm going how do I reconcile this?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I don't.
Yeah.
He was good and bad, just like I'm good and bad, just like lots of people are good and bad. And that I can appreciate the whole person, and stood up for him at his funeral service and gave the eulogy and expressed my love for him, and the understanding that this is humanness, right? And this is who we are, and it's okay.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That getting to that point where whatever someone did, yes, that they made the mistake. I happen to be in those crosshairs, but I'm in other people's crosshairs as well, and it just, life has people in it that that they sometimes don't know what they're doing, and that's not really doing it to me purposely. They just don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
That concept helps me immensely. It's like, life isn't doing this to me. Life is doing what it's doing.
Yeah.
It's like our current condition, which is COVID-19 lockdown, or restrictions. It's not singling out me. No. It's affecting me, but I don't need to get personal about it. And the same thing, like whether it's taxes or traffic or weather, I don't need to take it personally anymore. And I don't need to get angry and have a resentment as a result. Life will do what life does. It's my choice how to react to it.
Yeah. And someone asked me about when we go back to school in the fall with this whole quarantine and all that, what do you think is going to happen? What's the administration going to do? I said, I don't know, but it probably won't work in the beginning. I said, so I'm accepting that now rather than, boy, it better work. Like, it's just, they don't know everything either. So it's okay.
Yeah, I do a little home group literature study on Monday nights, and we're going through the traditions, and we're talking through some of these traditions. And the reason why those traditions are there is because it didn't work. Yeah. Right. It's like they weren't written in foresight. It was like in hindsight, wow, that didn't work. So we're just going to redo this and try again. And maybe we should write some things down. And like, it was like, I appreciate that. Like, they had the grace. I keep using the word grace in this talk, but it's so applicable. It's like, hey, like, this didn't work and we're new at this, so it's okay. Let's just try to write this down so we can course correct the future. Right. And just like that, I'm sure they'll do that at school and, and every other, version of what we're going to experience going forward.
I mean, I've been at a business meeting where we've spent more than 3 minutes discussing Folgers or Maxwell House. So it's coffee. We have to spend a lot of time, on something.
I remember having the cookie budget conversation.
Like, $50 is good. No, I think 100 is better. Like, oh no, how long are we going to vote? Can we vote on this? So yeah. All right. So your favorite story. It's one of my favorite stories. I'd like you to tell it, please.
Sure. So my favorite story is about my daughter and my wife. So I have on either side of our family, my side, we have my brother and his wife. They had a daughter same time we had ours, and my wife's sister and her husband had a daughter same time as us.
Okay, and I just want to break in. How many years are you sober at this point?
So it was around 10 years.
10 years. Okay.
Yeah. So what's interesting is when I came into the program, I knew I was messed up. I knew I was messed up, and I knew I had no skills whatsoever, and knew what my family was like. And I said, I'm going to need like 10 years sober and in therapy before I can have a kid.
Yeah.
And
you were right.
It was right. And it worked out. So within like 3-4 months of each other, all 3 cousins are born, right? So they grew up together quite a bit, sleepovers and hangouts and family stuff and over the years. So this is going back a few years ago though, but my daughter is now 18, so it's probably around age 15 or something like that, right? She winds up spending time with each cousin. So like on a Friday night, she goes sleeps over at my brother's house and spends time with that cousin, and then she goes over and spends time with the other cousin in the other house, and both of those families have problems, we'll say, so either addiction or mental illness or unhappy couples and homes. And my daughter spends time with both of those cousins and hears what it's like living in those households, right? Her cousins dish it all out, right? Yeah. My mom says this, my dad does that, etc. So after she spends the weekend with these 2 cousins in separate nights, she gets in the car with my wife Sunday morning, and she turns to my wife and goes, "Mom, thanks for picking the good one." And my wife turns to her and says, he wasn't always the good one. Right. Your dad had to work really hard to become the good one. Yeah. And when she relayed this to me, I was blown away. Number one, because somehow I got to be the good one.
Yeah.
Right. For a guy who was no good, right, not on a trajectory at all to be the good one, I've suddenly become the good one. And I say suddenly, it only took me 30 years.
Right. I stumbled into it 30 years. Yeah.
And I had to do and the fact that
inventories and therapy and all that stuff.
Yeah, it just happened. And and I love my wife, and she identified that I put a lot of effort into this, that I do a lot of work to both get to be the good one, to become a sober man today, and to maintain it.
Yeah. Yeah, I was saying not too long ago, my wife met me when I was 20 years sober, so when I celebrated 30, she was like, okay, that's nice. I mean, it wasn't anything monumental to her because she didn't know what I was like 30 years ago, or so it's like, yeah, you should be acting this way, and you should be sober behavior. And my son, actually he's my stepson, but it was a few years ago. He was a teenager, and him and his friends all did something dumb, and they got caught. And we're looking at the text messages on his phone between him and his friends. What'd your parents do? And as we're looking through, one says, my parents yelled at me. Yeah, mine did too. And then his says, oh yeah, my parents don't really yell. And we looked at it, and we looked at each other. Oh, we don't yell. Like we were so happy that he wasn't in that much trouble because we treat him different than I was treated as a kid.
Right.
So he recognizes it. So it's nice.
Yeah. One of the things that is, not only do we get an opportunity to break the addiction cycle for our kids, but I also get the chance to break the emotional relationship cycle.
Yeah.
That she doesn't have to grow up in a household like I grew up in.
Right.
And I get to model for her, me and my wife get to model for her what a loving, supportive relationship is. Yeah. So that when she goes and decides who she's going to spend the rest of her life with, that she can make a good choice based on stuff that we've demonstrated. Yeah. And again, that happened. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened as a result of, some hard-earned recovery and a lot of good people in front of me demonstrating that in meetings and conversations along the way.
Nice. Okay. One of the things I noticed over the past, I'll say 3 years, and I've known you for about 20 years now, right? We met, I'll say 19 years ago, and we've become very good friends. which again, I don't think is an accident either. How did that happen? Well, we share the same values and principles of the steps. And one of the things I've noticed is that you've gotten into a lot of service work, like holding big book meeting. You're very involved in your group, and the morning meeting, the 7 a.m. meeting, and you sponsor a lot of people. And it's 31 years. It's like, really, you're still doing all like you're still involved in it? Yeah. And can you talk about how do you do that at this point?
Yeah. Two things. One is my style supports it right now.
Okay.
Like my daughter's 18, so it's not like I have kids at home and little kids at home that need a lot of attention. My wife is very understanding and supportive of the work I do. It comes from enthusiasm, right? Okay. It's interesting that, I heard about Bill Wilson. Like once he got sober, he knew that like he was driven to carry the message, right? Mm-hmm. Even to people who didn't want to hear it.
Yeah, right. Plenty of those.
And like, I'm at a point where I'm not sure how else to be, right? It's like, this is working so well and it's so satisfactory. And when I look at my primary purpose, it's to carry the message, and to help others. So it's really I was going to say a labor of love, but it doesn't even feel like a labor. And it's something I'm driven by. Like I always look for, well, what's my purpose on life? Well, I happen to find one. There's a lot of people who go through life and never finding a purpose. Mm-hmm. I had some career stuff going on, well, for forever, but career direction stuff, and I'm able to say, I don't necessarily care about my career because my career doesn't define me. My work outside of my career defines me and gives me satisfaction. So I don't need to climb the corporate ladder or reach a certain status in that way. The fact that I'm a sponsor and I help others and go carry the message is more important. It was interesting. A friend of ours had celebrated recently, and I went down to see him celebrate, and we were talking afterwards at the meeting, at the diner after the meeting, and we were talking about meetings, how many meetings you go to. It was just kind of like it came up, and one guy goes, "Oh, I go to like 2 meetings a week." This guy has 30-something years, and the other guy has 30-something years. He goes, I go to 1. And the guy with like 5 years is like, I go like 3 or 4. And I'm like, I go to like 5 because I go to the morning meeting. I'm usually there like 5 days a week. Oh, then I've got my Friday night meeting, which I'm usually at. I guess it's like 5 or 6. And Sunday morning, I'm definitely at Sunday morning. And then, I got the literature group that I'm doing on Monday nights. And I was doing something else at the time too. I forgot. But it was, I'm like, I go like 7, 8 meetings a week. Like, how'd that happen? I didn't even realize and you know what? I'm friggin' happy, right? Yeah. My life is good. So there's a correlation there, right? The fact that it's right now, again, my lifestyle allows it, right? I go to a morning meeting and go coffee afterwards and come back and go to work is very helpful. But the value that I get out of it is so disproportionately better than what comes out of it than what I put into it.
Good. So sponsoring as many people as you do, and over the years as you've done it, what's something that you could tell somebody about sponsorship? Something that, boy, I did this and I really don't do this. A lot of people know what to do, but there's some things you don't know what not to do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as I go through my life, I'll always look back and go, "Oh, geez, I could have done that better." Mm-hmm. Or like, I can't believe what I was thinking. So, there's been times where I haven't given enough direction. Like after a 5th step, for example, helping tease out the columns a bit better. Realize I probably do that a little bit more. I think that spending time developing a friendship is good, but it's not the primary purpose of a sponsor. Mm-hmm. That my purpose is to help people get through the steps, and probably also, letting guys hang around too long. Not like, so the joke is, how many people do you sponsor? The answer is, I'm not sure, because it's 7 to 10, depending on who's actually involved, who's calling me and who's doing anything. And, so I do take a bit of a laissez-faire approach to sponsorship. I'm not one of these guys who's going to ride people to do the work. I'm not going to have them sign a contract. I'm not going to, I'm here as a resource and available. And, I'm not sure if that's the right approach or not, but at least that's where I'm at today.
Great. Thank you. So another thing I had down here is kind of NA versus AA. Mm-hmm. If there is such a thing for you, because like you said, you spent the first 10 years in NA and, the last 20 years or so more on AA. And as people come in, I when someone is talking about drugs in their story and someone says we don't talk about that here and all that stuff, I find myself frustrated to hear it. But I've never really been to NA in any significant amounts, and I'm still frustrated by it. And so I wanted to hear from someone who has been to both places and embraces both fellowships to talk about that a little bit.
It's interesting because when I was around, it seemed like NA was a lot looser, mm-hmm. right? In terms of we didn't really care about what you talked about, right? Okay. Lots of times drugs weren't mentioned. It was behavioral stuff or things outside of drugs. And AA was more restrictive in terms of wanting to hear about other substances. And it seems like that has flipped over the years, that mm-hmm. NA has tried to protect its identity more and mm-hmm. and not want to hear the terms like sober and drugs and alcohol and things like that, okay. Which is fine. That was the decision that fellowship made. And at least in the circles I go to, my AA meetings, they talk about drugs all the time, right? And someone, my sponsee just mentioned, he goes, I don't know anybody under 30 who hasn't duly duly used substances. Part of why I started going to AA was, number one, I had a newborn baby, right? And mm-hmm. so the difference between an hour and a half meeting and an hour meeting is that much longer. I was away from family. Plus, I wound up in a group of friends at that Summit Saturday morning meeting who were doing AA, and I'm like, oh, this is pretty good. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I feel like I don't belong in either sometimes. Because when I go to when I go to speak on AA, I don't have an AA beginner story, right? I have an NA beginner story, but I haven't been in NA seriously for 20 years. So I feel like a fraud if I go speak there. So, it's this weird thing where I'm not settled in either one.
Feel like an imposter.
An imposter, yeah. Now, I identify primarily as an alcoholic because I feel like alcoholism affects all those areas of my life, right? Even Bill talked about the emotional sobriety and codependency and all that other stuff. He recognized it. And so I also found that the program works, the process works. So no need for me to go and do anything different about it. So I've been to a few more NA meetings in the past year than I have previously, both to go support people or to speak. And again, I enjoy the fellowship. It was funny. I forgot how kind of enthusiastic those meetings were. It was a celebration meeting, and it was like that's the energy I remember. And so there's a kind of this longing that I have in terms of, shouldn't I be giving back, and maybe I should return to my roots and all that, but how to get past the feeling like a tourist.
Yeah, right. So we're coming towards the last bit of it here, and one of the things I started doing with this podcast is asking people about literature outside of our meeting literature that has helped shaped where your recovery is today. And you gave me a long list. So the book I'd like you to talk about is The Human Condition by Thomas Keating.
So that book caught my eye. I don't even remember where I picked it up from, but it was either recommended or I fell in my lap, as often these things do, right? Mm-hmm. Spiritual books and guides point us in a certain direction when we're ready. And I loved it because it talked about who am I and where am I, and I adopted those questions throughout my recovery since, and it was talked about a little bit about who am I, how am I identifying, and what am I identifying with, and a lot of the things he mentioned about how I build this concept of myself, right, and identify with my tribe or certain conditions in my life that then become my story, and how that limits us. And the where am I is where am I in relationship to God, right? And so there's he uses an old story about there's a monk and a student, and the student comes up, and the monk's looking around in the grass in front of his building, his house or whatever, and the student says, "What are you doing?" And the monk says, "Oh, I'm looking for my keys to get in." And it's like, okay, so they start looking around, and he goes, "Are you sure this is where you lost them?" And he's like, "No, but the light's better out here." And the point is, we're often looking for the key in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Right? That my relationship to God is not out there somewhere; it's inside. So it's a small book, and every so often I'll go back and I'll pull it up and I'll read it again. Mine's completely fallen apart at this point. I've read it through enough times, and it also made some interesting talk, very similar to AA talk about. We have this condition where our toes get stepped on, right, and we react, right, and it was just helpful to hear that in another place, right? To like, oh yeah, okay, I'm setting up conditions for other people to disappoint me, and it's really what I've created that's caused that problem. And he also talks about some other things around development stages, and that because we experienced trauma as a kid, that we're repeating that over and over again. So there's some pieces there which I really loved. And I bought extra copies and sent them around to some friends.
Yes, you did. I have a copy. I read it.
Yeah.
It's a great book. It's a great read.
The other book, which I don't know if you're going to bring up or not, but the other book, which it's funny, like I forgot about, and then when you asked me the question, I went and looked, was So You Want to Be Like Christ, right? And this is when I was more churchy than I am today, and now that I found it on my bookshelf, I'm like, oh yeah, it's really good, and it sounds real arrogant as a book title. It's like, so you want to be like Christ? Like here's how you become like Christ. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, yeah, like some of this is a little tough, right? Like what Christ-like qualities are, but they're all doable, and a lot of them are reflected in our steps, right? In our fellowship. And it's like, yeah, like the shifting of my perception that I could never be like Christ to I could be like Christ. Yeah, like I can move in that direction. Right? I should not give up before I even start because I discount it completely. It's like, yeah, I can be like Christ. Why the hell not? Let me start doing some things behaviorally and the way I perceive things to be like Christ. Yeah. It's okay.
It's like you can dabble in Christianity for a little bit if you want to, right?
Yeah.
And if you like it, you can just go further. It's okay.
And like most spiritual practices and beliefs, they're universal, right? I was experiencing a lot of grief after my dad passed, right? And I thought I shouldn't, like I should be beyond this, right? I'm spiritual now, and so I was talking with a friend, and I made this thing I made this comment of well, I'm trying to be like these people, right? Right, these spiritual greats, and he's like, why don't you just be the best Tom?
Right.
Like that's the world has a Christ and a Buddha and they need the best Tom.
Yeah. Or even just a little bit better, Tom, than you were yesterday. I don't know, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So before we wrap up, is there anything you wanted to use the platform to discuss or express that I did not cover?
Wow, that's an open-ended question right there. So I'll stick with the kind of the theme of the podcast and talk about seasons of recovery. Is that I wish that I got sober at 18 and I had this straight line trajectory of recovery that I follow straight up to sainthood. Mm-hmm. It's not the case. It's not going to be the case for anybody. I stumbled. I fell back into old behaviors. I fell into new behaviors. I just am grateful that I never picked up a drink or a drug. The program and the spiritual practices are always there to come back to. As much as I stepped away from meetings for a while and they weren't doing anything for me. I'll put that in air quotes. Those meetings don't do anything for me anymore. Well, you know what? You're 12 years sober. Maybe you're supposed to be doing for it, not expecting to be entertained. Right. It's important for, I think, newcomers and certainly old timers know as well, is it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to admit that, at 5 years sober, I was suicidal. At 10 years sober, I was so consumed with resentment that I couldn't, feel any of the promises that at 17 years sober, I fell away from meetings and sponsor myself, and what a mess it is. I think it's important to share that it's okay to not be perfect, and that, I earlier I talked about sharing the solution, but part of sharing the solution is saying, I screwed up, and here's the solution to that screw up. It's okay to not be perfect and to experience these things, and because I think it's a disservice to people who come behind us to find to think that things just magically get better. I had a sponsee. We talked about sponsees earlier, and I sponsor a couple agnostics and an atheist, and that's interesting. But one of the things he questioned me about was like the promises. It's like, this is really a tall order, and I'm like, it comes after step 9, right? And it says this, as long as we thoroughly follow this path, and so I think it's important to say this thing works, but it's a process. It gets better with refinement, and it's the level of effort that I put into it that I get out of it. That's why things are so great for me today versus when I was a teenager, my teenage years, and I was in the, and not doing anything for my program and not experiencing any of the promises and
being pissed about it. That how come it's not happening?
Yeah, exactly. Why am I so unhappy?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom. That's I think that's a good place to wrap up here.
Thank you.
And thank you again for allowing me to come over and sit in your sunroom and hear the birds and all the other stuff in the background. And it's really nice, and really grateful to have you share your story on the podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
We have come to the end of this episode of the Seasons of Sobriety podcast. I trust that you were able to identify with the personal story of our guest, and perhaps apply some of their experience to give you the hope needed to persevere through your own journey. If you would like to be a guest on the show or would like to suggest a guest, please send an email to podcast@seasonsofsobriety.com. The email address can also be found in the show notes. This podcast has been completely self-funded. If you believe today's episode has been beneficial, I ask that you either contribute a little extra this week to your home group or other meetings, or consider a donation directly to the podcast. This can be done at our website, seasonsofsobriety.com, which can also be found in the show notes. Until next time, remember, if you have trouble practicing the principles of the steps in all your affairs, you may have too many affairs.